So this week we enter the fifth and final book of the Torah, Sefer Devarim. And Sefer Devarim is a book unlike the first four in many significant ways. First of all, it's named by in Jewish tradition as Mishneh Torah, which is not an easy thing to translate. Either a review of the Torah, an explanation of the Torah, but very significantly in the fifth book of the Torah, what does not appear and what appears throughout the whole Torah is a phrase like Vayidaber Hashem el Moshe Lemor, that God spoke to Moshe saying, because indeed this entire book of the Torah is Moshe speaking. Now that raises a very fundamental question, because we know we have a Tanakh, we have our holy writings, which consist of three parts: the Torah itself, which is the most holy and which is directly the word of Hashem; the prophets, which cover a 1,000-year period of Jewish history following the chronicles of the Torah, which is deemed to be less holy and very significantly cannot replace or change any aspect of the Torah. And then we have Ketuvim, we have writings which are also very important, such things as the book of Esther and of Ruth and the book of Psalms. Those are all part of the writings. Those are not direct prophecies, but rather they are, in a certain sense, chronicles written down by prophetic individuals. And then we have the end of prophecy in Jewish tradition. Basically, 1,000 years after the Exodus, we have the last, very final prophets. And then by tradition, there's no more prophecy. But to get back to our issue is as follows. If this fifth book of the Torah is spoken by Moshe, how is it different than the next book of Joshua, which is spoken by Yehoshua? And the answer is very significant. First of all, Moshe was unique as a prophet of the Jewish people. It's a cardinal principle of Judaism that do not confuse the prophecy of Moshe with the prophecy of any other prophet. It was different in its character, in its nature, in its intensity, and its directness of communication to God. As the Torah itself says, face to face, I spoke to Moshe. Another critical difference is that God would speak to a prophet, and then that prophet would, a day later, 2 days later, recount the prophecy he received. Whereas with Moshe, that wasn't the case. And especially, for example, at Mount Sinai itself, the Jewish people saw a display of God speaking to Moshe. Again, the first two commandments are deemed to have been heard directly from God. Jewish people, as the Torah recounts, approached God and said, it's too overwhelming for us to directly hear God speak to us. And hence the remaining 8 commandments of the 10 commandments, the people could visibly see and to an extent hear God speaking to Moshe and then Moshe speaking to them. But that's the way the entire Torah is. So what's different about this fifth book of the Torah? One explanation is as follows. These final 37 days of Moshe's life, Moshe took it upon himself to teach the entirety of the Torah. And in that sense, it's a repetition of the Torah. But what does it mean to teach an entirety of the Torah? To go through all 613 commandments, to go through the entire chronicles of the Jewish people up until that point, and to give admonition and advice and direction to the Jewish people that Moshe himself understood was needed. And from that 37 days of discourse, God selected paragraphs, sections of what Moshe taught and dictated to Moshe to put them into the Torah itself. And hence those words become elevated into Torah itself, and they're not deemed to be words of prophecy, but rather they're to be part and parcel of the Torah, where tradition tells us that every word and every sentence and every letter has utmost importance, even though we value certain words and certain ideas more than others. and therefore the entirety of the Torah is to be treated with equal sanctity and equal reverence. And hence, of course, in a Sefer Torah itself, if there's a mistake in the fifth book of the Torah, that means renders the entire Torah pasul, even if it's a small mistake. It has to be corrected before the Torah could be used, because that would be an affront to the overall integrity of the Torah. Something else about this idea of reviewing of the Torah, there are 613 mitzvot. Surprisingly, 200 of them, just about a third of them, appear and are derived from this fifth book of the Torah. So the idea that it's just review is not really the case. And I think a cogent way of fixing our mindset as we enter this fifth book of the Torah is, as we often do here, rely on the insight of Rav Shamshin Raphael Hirsch, the 19th century German Jewish rabbi who wrote a very seminal explanation of the Torah. And he says that the entire book of Devarim was Moshe's viewpoint of exactly what the Jewish people needed to hear and think about as they were prepared to cross the Jordan and enter into the land of Israel, very much referring to a transition which we discussed last week in detail. Also, what I would add, and with significance, and this is going to be the undertow of this week's class, which is titled Bringing Torah Forward, Moshe fully understood that his leadership of the Jewish people was coming to an end, that this would be his final discourse, so to speak, to the Jewish people, and included in them crossing into the Jordan and entering a different stage of Jewish history, a much more natural stage of Jewish history, where they weren't being carried on eagle's wings, so to speak. Although, of course, we know today, these 3,300 years later, that there is no such thing as a natural course of Jewish history. There's no epoch or period or even decade of Jewish living that anyone could say just flow naturally. And believe me, our eyes are very open to that today as we see the flow of events taking place around and within the Jewish people. But so this is Moshe's final presentation to us, the Jewish people, giving us the understanding is we need this as we separate from Moshe's leadership, as we come down a notch from the tremendously high level of prophecy of a Moshe who spoke face to face to God, and we enter an epoch where we're crossing the Jordan River, we're going to become farmers, we're going to live, we're going to spread out into the land, and we're going to be led by a great, great prophet of God, Joshua. But in comparison to Moshe, the Talmud tells us that if Moshe was like a sun shining forth, Yoshua was like the moon reflecting, a reflection of the greatness of Moshe Rabbeinu. So we're going to look at these ideas now, and these ideas have very much importance to us as we also approach the very solemn day of Tisha B'Av next Monday night, Tuesday, the mourning that takes place for the temple, and all that represents. So let's get into it now, and let's try to understand this. And let's begin by looking at the sequence in this Torah. In this week's Torah reading, there are only two mitzvot, and they both have to do with the appointment of judges. And if we look at the text on page 941, we could read the sentences here which have to do with that, and I think they're important. Sorry, it's on page 943. It begins on 941, where Moshe explains, I cannot carry you alone. The Jewish people were a complex group. So what did Moshe say in sentence 15? So I took the heads of your tribes, distinguished men who were wise and well-known, page 943. This, in fact, contains a mitzvah of the 613 mitzvot. And I appointed them as heads over you, leaders of thousands, leaders of hundreds, leaders of 50s, and leaders of tens. and officers of your tribes. I instructed your judges at that time, listen among your brothers and judge righteously between a man and his brother or his litigant. Don't show favoritism, and these are the laws of judges. Now, what's significant against this? Well, first of all, in the context that I was explaining before, Moshe is referring back to something that happened at the time of Yitro, with his father-in-law Jethro coming out and seeing that Moshe was attempting to judge the people alone. But in the context that we are talking about, that this is Moshe preparing the Jewish people to have a leader of lesser stature and to close out this specific period, biblical period of Jewish history, which commenced at the creation and comes to a conclusion 2,488 years later at the moment that Moshe leaves this world with the Jewish people perched just outside the land of Israel at the banks of the Jordan River. This epic is ending. So Moshe significantly refers back to the decisions that were made to decentralize the role of being a judge amongst the Jewish people. And in fact, according to certain counts, there were basically 130, 131 appointed officials for every 1,000 Jewish people, showing, a little bit the difficulty of managing and handling the Jewish people. But there's an undertow here that's very important. In sentence 12, Moshe highlights the idea that I can't carry your burdens and your quarrels. And Rashi there points out on chapter 1, sentence 12, Rashi, that Moshe was highlighting the fact that for me alone to have been your judge, even these past 40 years from leaving Egypt, the problem was a problem of trust. Because Rashi refers to the idea that there would always be suspicion. You would always be questioning my motives, something we see often in the Torah. And therefore, by decentralizing the judgeship and by having people from amongst every tribe and practically every family, when you look at the ratio, undertake a position of leadership for the Jewish people, that meant that the people would know their leaders much more closely. Their leaders would be in the context of the Jewish people. And as one non-Jewish thinker recently put it, Moshe was here avoiding himself becoming a pharaoh, so to speak, of the Jewish people by seeing to it that the Jewish people could become, on a certain level, self-governing with only the most difficult matters and the most important issues being brought directly to Moshe's attention. So here we have an idea which has immense import and significance when you think about this transition of leadership. Going back to the beginning of Yetziat Mitzrayim, Moshe points out here in this fifth book of the Torah that I understood that the greater the gap there would be between me as the lawgiver, as the messenger of God, between me and the rest of the people, the more problems would ensue. And that was the thinking that went into the idea of creating a system of judges and a system of leadership that spread out amongst the people so that your leaders would be familiar to you, they would be close to you, they could be examples and role models for you in a much more intimate and direct setting. And just parenthetically, when the Talmud talks about different efforts to save Torah amongst the Jewish people, it points out the efforts of one particular Talmudic sage who came to a village where there was no knowledge of Torah. And what did he do? So you would think he would set up a bima, a stage, and he would start teaching Torah. That's not what he did. He gathered children, and he taught 5 children each one of the books of the Torah. He took 6 other children. He taught each one of the sections of the Talmud. And then he had each one teach the other. He created, so to speak, a grassroots, peer-to-peer connection in the study of Torah, because that's what gives life to things. That's what carries things on. Of course, we need great individual leaders who can provide guidance to a whole nation and a direction to a whole people. But on a regular functioning, people are going to internalize the values of the Torah, and they're going to be ready to actualize them in their own personal lives, in their own private homes, in their heart of hearts, even when no one's watching them. It can't be coming from on high, so to speak, but it has to be in the context of a close community of peers where people are connected to one another and there is authority given to members of the group, but it's all within a close confines. And we're going to see how big an idea that is. Because now we're going to move on to what occupies the central part of this first chapter of the fifth book of the Torah. And that, of course, is Moshe recounting the sin of the spies. And there's tremendous significance to this. And this is where we're going to dig into our real essence of our theme of bringing Torah forward. What does it take to bring Torah forward? So the spies are recounted here by Moshe in his personal narrative, presenting it here in a way that sheds a lot of light on things. It sheds light in terms of the sense of where this came from and Moshe's diagnosis of the problem of the spies. Because essentially, Moshe says here, and we're going to look at it, sentences 19 to 41 in chapter 1, and it's pages 943, 944, 945, 946. Moshe says something here he didn't say before. He liked the idea of the spies because he originally saw the spies, I want to add, in the way we have been explaining the judgment of the Jewish people. He saw the spies as it appealed to him because let a member of each tribe go and see the land, scout out the land, come back with tactical advice, and then it would be widespread amongst the Jewish people. Okay, now we're ready to move on. Of course, the whole thing blew up in the faces of Moshe and the Jewish people, and it led, in fact, to the tragic result that Moshe details here, which is the entire nation, that entire generation died out in the wilderness. And surprisingly, the issue here becomes an issue of trust. And let's look at these sentences. Let's start at sentence 19 quickly and we'll move through them. I'm sorry, we're going to start on sentence 26. The spies come back. The spies give a report that the land is good. They all reported that. But you did not wish to ascend, sentence 26, and you rebelled against the word of Hashem, your God. You slandered in your tents and said, because of Hashem's hatred for us, did he take us out of the land of Egypt to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites to destroy us? To where shall we ascend? Our brothers have melted our hearts, saying, a people greater and taller than we, cities great and fortified to the heavens, and even children of giants have we seen there. And of course, all this took place on Tisha B'Av. Sentence 29. Then I said to you, do not be broken, do not fear them. Hashem, your God, who goes before you, he shall make war for you, like everything he did for you in Egypt before your eyes. And Moshe continues with that theme. But the people still demurred. Hashem heard, sentence 34, just a brevity here. Hashem heard the sound of your words and he was incensed, and he swore, saying, if even a man of these people, this evil generation, shall see the good land I swore to give to your forefathers, except for Kalev, the son of Yefuneh, and Yoshua, they shall see it, but the rest of you shall not. Now, if you look at what's going on here, I would describe Moshe's narrative itself as being a narrative of a loss of nerve. And that's what has to become clear to us. Were the people just afraid? I mean, we encounter fear in our lives. We sometimes go out and say, okay, I'm going to go out to raise money for a worthwhile cause and institution. And the first two people slam the doors in our face or say it's a stupid idea, and we feel daunted and we feel frightened, and we lose our verb and our nerve and our commitment to an idea, and we shrink back. Moshe does not in any way, shape, or form construe it this way. He rather construes it as a lack of faith and belief. Let's look at sentences 31 and 32 on page 945. And let's look at the way Moshe explains it. We'll start at 31. And in the wilderness, as you have seen that Hashem your God bore you as a man carries his child on the entire way that you traveled until you arrived at this place. Yet in this matter, you do not believe in Hashem your God, who goes before you on the way to seek out for you a place for you to encamp with fire by night. What Moshe is saying here is something astounding. He uses the word emunah, einchem ma'aminim. You're not, we would translate it as you are not believers in God. This sheds a lot of light on the nature and understanding of belief in Judaism. You know, we're content in our context to say there's no atheists in the foxholes. Okay, so it's nice when you're in the foxhole and you're watching people getting blown to bits around you, for you to cry out to God and say, God, save me. But that's not what emunah means here. That's what einchem ma'aminim. Einchem ma'aminim is that you weren't able to translate your individual knowledge and experience in dealing with Hashem and apply that understanding to the choice you are making. It's as direct and it needs to be as clear as that. Emunah b'Hashem means the ability to take what you have seen and heard and experienced, to understand it in the context of your relationship with God, and then to act upon it. Okay? And I'll give you two very cogent examples of that. When Moshe first comes to see the Jewish people back in Egypt, Moshe tells God they're not going to believe me. They won't believe that you're sending me to redeem them. And it says he made the signs and the people believed. What does it mean the people believe? Their spirits were raised. It wasn't just, I believe. It wasn't just calling out to Hashem, but rather it was a sense that we are now prepared to follow the directives of Hashem wherever they will lead us, in complete harmony with the announced plans that God is going to redeem us from Egypt. And that's quite a stretch because they were there for hundreds of years already. Generations of Jewish people had been born and died in Egypt. And yet when Moshe came, they had a sense of emunah, of belief, trust, and will to act upon that commitment, to actually go so far as to take the idol of the Egyptians and tie it to their bedpost and then slaughter it and make an offering to God while they were still enslaved in Egypt, albeit at the end of between the 9th and 10th plague. But they had that fortitude within them. We see it again very significantly at the splitting of the sea. And that really merits our attention, which we will, but if you look at page 374 in the Stone Chumash, it's Exodus chapter 14, sentence 31. We say it every day in davening in the morning. Vayaminu b'Hashem u'b'Moshe avdo. When the Jewish people saw the sea split, and it saw the very miracle that rescued them from the Egyptians, also destroy the Egyptians, that experience of being rescued caused within them everything that they had seen throughout the whole Exodus process and throughout their initial week traveling in the wilderness to click in. And what they became were people who had an understanding of life, which we call emunah, which meant that they had a faith, a belief, and a commitment to act in accordance with that belief. And with this understanding, we see clearly why Moshe characterizes the loss of will and the loss of resolve of the Jewish people to move on into the land after the report of the spies. the events of that first Tisha B'Av, when the Jewish people cried by their tents, which is explained as crying for no reason, because they were no longer able to translate the experience they had. And that's what Moshe is saying here. You've been carried through the wilderness for all this time. You were rescued from Egypt. God's promising to bring you to the land, and you don't have the will to translate that experience into the bravery, or at least into the willingness to go forward under God's direction. Let's hold on to that idea very, very much. So going back to the splitting of the sea, then, we see here, Vayaminu b'Hashem, the people at that point attained a complete, deep, encompassing faith, trust, and will to act in consonance with Hashem, u'b'Moshe avdo, and they at the simultaneously understood that there would be no mistrust possible in their relationship with Moshe. At that moment, all the disruptions that took place in the wilderness, all the sense of, did you bring us to this place to kill us? Why did we have to circle back towards the Sea of Reeds? Why don't we have meat to eat? All these crises that were going to unfold time after time after the time included a distrust, which was of Moshe, and ultimately the sense that Moshe articulates here, which is shocking. They thought that Besinat Hashem, that God hates us. What's the exact quote here? The exact quote is that they deteriorated to a point that their feeling was that rather than God being apparent to them, and rather than them being the recipient of Hashem's benevolence, they became so distrusting and so disconnected from the experiences that they'd already had, that they even could go far as to think that out of hatred, God has brought us to this place. That's what Moshe articulates when he recounts the sin of the spies. I want to add an important couple of thoughts here. If I was translating the phrase Besinat Hashem with God hating us, Besinat Hashem otanu, out of hatred, not out of love, not out of devotion, but rather out of hatred. It's sentence 27 in chapter 1, just to get it exactly right, 945. Okay. Because of Hashem's hatred for us, did he take us out of the land of Egypt? I would translate that today, and this is a thought here. It's not a source. Does God care about me being happy? Yes, I understand God's the ruler of the world. We have 3,300 years of experience as a Jewish people of being constantly rescued. We have the experience of seeing the land of Israel rejuvenated in our lifetimes. We have seen so much. And yet deep down, what causes us to lose our resolve to fall and sink is because to a great extent we come to believe that my happiness is going to be found someplace else. And that part and parcel of Hashem's program for redeeming us from Egypt, for giving us a Torah, for elevating us, for carrying forward all of the ideas of the matriarchs and patriarchs of the Jewish people and implanting them within us, we to some extent say, okay, we'll buy into that. We'll accept that. But give us a break. On the side, we've got to make ourselves happy. And we have to have different values. And we're worried about being happy. And we have this element of distrust that even if I'm totally righteous and I'm really a good person and I really fulfill everything Hashem wants, will I really be happy doing that? And to the extent that we harbor this level, which Moshe points out is ultimately distrust of God's ultimate motivation for us, to that extent, we are going to lose our resolve, lose our nerve. We're not going to be bought in to the plan and the program of Jewish living, and we're not going to see ourselves as completely absorbed within the destiny of the Jewish people. And I want to prove this idea to you in certain ways, that it really comes down to a sense of happiness and contentment. There's an unusual statement in the Talmud, which we should all be mindful of as we approach Tisha B'Av. And the statement in the Talmud, it's in Rosh Hashanah, the 18b. And Shkula mitoton shel tzadikim kisreifat beit Elokeinu. That the passing away of a righteous person has as strong an impact on those alive at the time as did the burning down of the temple in Jerusalem, which we're going to mark on both of those days. Sounds like a preposterous statement. People are born, they live, and they die. When a righteous person passes away, how could this possibly be equated to seeing the destruction of the temple? And the answer is this. Because the righteous person, going back to the theme we developed with the judges, he lives amongst us. He lives part of us. And we who have had the privilege of having great Torah teachers, we get the opportunity to see their happiness, their satisfaction, the depth of their resolve and commitment, and how undaunted they are in the face of challenges, and how they go through life strong and focused, not out of a pure sense of dread or worry from punishment, but because there's wind under their sails, and because they have seen and understand every life experience as being a gift to Hashem and being a privilege to be part of everything that they're doing. And I dare say this was even felt by Jewish people at times of great tragedy. Well, think about these ideas. I think it's really an important idea. I would back it up by saying something special. Every Shabbat morning when we daven Shacharis, we say something which always jumps off the page at me. In the Amidah in Shacharit in the morning, what do we say? What do we take note of? We take note of one particular fact, and it's on page 424 in the Art Scroll Siddur. Moshe rejoiced in the gift of his portion, that you called him a faithful servant. We talk about the simcha, the happiness, the joyousness that Moshe lived for every day of his existence. That's a wild thing to think about. When we think about leaders, when we want to remember great righteous people, if we think about Maimonides, or we think about Rashi, or we think about people more even that we have known ourselves, we should highlight to ourselves the sense of joy and happiness they experienced as a proof to us how much Hashem's ultimate wish is only good for us. And good always involves happiness and joy. And hence the curses at the end of the Torah say, Tachat asher avadato Hashem Elokecha b'simcha v'tuv lev, that the ultimate cause of this separation and the Jewish people becoming estranged is because we didn't experience joy and happiness, and we didn't build our personal fulfillment within the confines of experiencing this relationship with Hashem. So the Torah is opening a door for us. Tisha B'Av opens a door for us. The Jewish people sat on this first Tisha B'Av and they mourned. They sat Shiva. They were Avelim. Why? Because they felt they were in a place where they were lost, with no potential future happiness and joy and fulfillment or future, and that it was out of God's animus to them that they were in this place. It has to be rebuilt. The fifth and final book of the Torah is Moshe as the Jewish leader, who is canonized in our Shabbos morning prayers as Yismach Moshe b'matnas chelko. Moshe lived in joyousness, and hence our relationship to Moshe is an absolute bridge in our relationship to Hashem, not because Moshe is an intermediary, God forbid, and not because God doesn't directly hear the voices of every single human being who calls out to God. God does all of that. But we need the examples to steel ourselves, to chase away those shadows and those doubts, and to understand that if we are facing certain burdens of fulfilling the will of Hashem, if we're facing hatred today by being identified as Jews, it's all within the context of God lovingly pursuing our opportunity for ultimate happiness, ultimate meaning, ultimate joy in this world as well as in the world to come. And just a final thought. These are pretty dense thoughts and they merit a little bit more attention. But we recite keynote. What are keynote? Keynote are dirges, they're lamentations. The book of Eicha, Jeremiah the prophet sat on the ground. He had predicted and foreseen through prophecy the destruction of the temple. He had warned the people. He pleaded with the people, and he lived through it. And he sat on the ground at the river, leaving the land of Israel and heading into Babylonia. And he lamented. Why did he write that book? Who was he writing it for? He was writing it for us and for all the Jews who would come after him, because he wanted us to understand that if you want to know what sadness and unhappiness is, it's being separated from being part of Hashem's plan. It's being forced out of the land that Hashem promised for us. It's the very antithesis of what the Jewish people mourned on that first Tisha B'Av. And so every Tisha B'Av since, we sit on the ground and we mourn the fact that if we're going to feel sadness and sorrow over anything, it's only going to be because we're distanced from Hashem and we yearn to be reconnected. In that sense, Tisha B'Av becomes a day of joy and happiness in the future, and the ultimate end of days, when all of these breaches become rectified and when the world falls into good order. We'll take the book of Eicha and we'll read it with joy and smiles on our faces, because it'll remind us over and over again how much Hashem cares about our happiness, how much Hashem cares about our fulfillment. And we can use the springboard of a Moshe, or even those righteous people that we've had the privilege to know in our own personal lives, even our own parents, who may have already left this world. And in that sense, their passing out of the world, our distance from them, is equal to the sense of the temple being destroyed, because it all represents an artificial separation from meaningfulness, from joy, from happiness, and from understanding the extent to which Hashem nurtures us, cares for us, watches over us, and literally carries us on God's back every step of the way. We should have a meaningful Tisha B'Av. There will be no class next Tuesday,